Hello and welcome to the turbulent world with me, James M. Dorsey, as your host. This week, Israeli Prime Minister Binyamin Netanyahu accelerated the Jewish state's travels towards international pariah status by declaring that the Gaza war aims to expel Gazan Palestinians from their homeland. Mr. Netanyahu added resettlement of Gaza's 2.1 million Palestinians to his war goals, after earlier adopting as official Israeli policy a plan to move Gazans out of the Strip, first put forward by US President Donald Trump in February. Earlier, Mr. Netanyahu insisted that he would only end the Gaza war once the Israeli army had destroyed Hamas, or if the group agrees to disarm and send its leaderships and fighters into exile. Mr. Trump envisioned Palestinians being resettled in Egypt, Jordan, and elsewhere so that Gaza could be turned into a high end real estate development. The international community has virtually unanimously condemned his plan. Many charge that it would amount to ethnic cleansing and violate international law. Even so, Israel has sought to gradually implement the plan and placate Israel's remaining supporters by relaxing rules governing departures from Gaza. In recent months, several Israel has allowed some 1,000 Palestinians with foreign citizenship and their families, as well as students with foreign scholarships, to leave Gaza. They included people who Israel had barred from travel for security reasons. Supporters of Mr. Netanyahu's latest war goals hope the departures are the tip of the iceberg. A recent Palestinian opinion poll suggested that Israel's 19-month-long decimation of Gaza to a pile of rubble and its blocking of the unfettered entry of humanitarian goods into the Strip has persuaded almost half of the territory's population to consider resettlement. 43% of those surveyed said they were willing to leave Gaza. 49% suggested they would be willing to ask Israel to allow them to depart through Israeli air and seaports. Israeli officials were likely also encouraged by mounting Gazan resentment of Hamas. 48% of those surveyed supported recent anti Hamas protests, demanding that the group surrender control of the Strip, even though a majority believed external forces had instigated the demonstrations. Nevertheless, Netanyahu's adoption of the Trump plan as a war goal ensures that there will be no resolution of the Israeli Palestinian conflict. It will force Israel to continue to live by the sword indefinitely, a prospect already envisioned by legendary Israeli Chief of Staff and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan in the 1950s. The adoption will likely fuel Israel's further isolation, with some of its closest allies distancing themselves, given broad international support for a two-state resolution of the conflict, involving the creation of an independent Palestinian state next to Israel. By making Mr. Trump's plan a war goal, Mr. Netanyahu has officially changed the nature of the century-old Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Adding resettlement or ethnic cleansing to Israel's war goals cements Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim beliefs that resettlement was Israel's unofficial goal from day one. They point to the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians during the 1948 and 1967 Middle East wars, and Israel's post 1967 policy of establishing settlements on occupied Palestinian lands. Neither the Israel Defense Forces nor the government seems to understand the depth of the looming international crisis, said journalist Amos Harel. Compounding the risk of further isolation and becoming a pariah state, Israel's adoption of the Trump plan as a war goal guarantees that no Arab state, including Saudi Arabia, will recognize Israel and could put the country's peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan, fearful that West Bank Palestinians could be next in jeopardy. That may be where the rub is. in Mr. Trump's attitude towards Israel's policy change, even though Israel's war goal is based on his plan. Mr. Trump sees engineering Saudi and Arab recognition of Israel as a pillar of his Middle East policy. Moreover, making the expulsion of Palestinians dressed up as voluntary departures a war goal casts a different light on Israel's almost 3-month-long blocking of the flow of any humanitarian aid into Gaza, including food, medicine, and fuel, and Mr. Netanyahu's campaign to undermine Qatari efforts to mediate a Gaza ceasefire. The blocking of aid may be the straw that breaks the camel's back by widening the emerging gap between Messrs. Trump and Netanyahu and sparking the harshest criticism of Israel to date by some of its closest allies. Mr. Netanyahu's added war goal could sway countries like Britain, Canada, and France to recognize Palestine as a state. The three countries have for weeks said they were discussing possible recognition in response to Israel's blocking the flow of humanitarian goods into Gaza since March 2. Israel has, in recent days, allowed a minuscule number of trucks carrying humanitarian goods into Gaza, far below the Strip's minimal needs. UN officials described the flow as a drop in the ocean. Recognition of Palestine as a state is likely to be high on the agenda of a June 18 gathering convened by France and Saudi Arabia under the auspices of the United Nations to promote a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So is a muted French-Saudi plan intended to break the stalemate in the Gaza ceasefire talks that would require Hamas to disarm but allow it to retain political influence by functioning as a political group rather than a militia. With the destruction of Hamas as one of his war goals, Mr. Netanyahu accused Britain, France, and Canada of being on the wrong side of history and wanting Hamas to remain in power. Mr. Netanyahu didn't mention Saudi Arabia, but his assertion presumably also applies to the kingdom. The French-Saudi proposal builds on Hamas's declared willingness to walk away from governing post-war Gaza in the face of widespread popular resentment of the group and the knowledge that it would be an obstacle to reconstruction and incapable of attracting the funding and international support needed. Hamas's willingness was in the making long before the group attacked Israel on October 7, 2023, sparking the Gaza war. Israel's blockade of Gaza since the group took control of the Strip in 2007, with Egypt's support, undermined Hamas's ability to legitimize its rule by effectively providing goods and services. Writing about the blockade in place since Israel's 2008 attack on Gaza, dubbed Operation Cast Lead, historian Eric Scare noted that the blockade could never produce Israeli security, only immense Palestinian suffering. 17 years later, that is truer than ever. Mr. Netanyahu's encouragement of Qatari funding of Hamas's Gaza administration as a way of keeping the Palestinian polity divided so that it would be incapable of negotiating a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict came to haunt the Prime Minister with the group's deadly October 7 attack. Referring to Israel's long-standing blockade, Mr. Scare noted in a just-published book, governing Gaza under a blockade and international isolation deepened Hamas hardliners' conviction that there was no political or diplomatic solution. True to Israeli policy since the 1967 Middle East War that strengthened Palestinian hardliners rather than moderates, Mr. Netanyahu balanced funding of Hamas with policies that favored hardliners in the group's internal politicking. October 7 happened because the moderates in Hamas had few, if any, victories to show after the movement won the legislative elections in 2006, Mr. Scare asserted. Like the West Bank-based internationally recognized Palestine Authority, Hamas realized the government created a different reality in which it was responsible for securing Gaza's borders, and with it, Israel's borders, despite upholding the principle of armed struggle. The legitimacy of Hamas in Gaza no longer derives solely from its status as an armed resistance movement, but as a service provider to the Gazan population as well, Mr. Scare said. Hamas's dichotomy, exploited by Israel with its blockade, frames the group's attitude towards disarmament. The group has spoken about the issue from both sides of its mouth. At times, the group has insisted it will not disarm. Yet, Hamas officials have also suggested they would be willing to put their arsenal under the supervision of a third party, possibly the Palestine Liberation Organization or Egypt, as part of a ceasefire that ends the war and guarantees an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Lebanon could provide a precedent, even though Hamas is likely to be more amenable to disarmament in a third country like Lebanon as opposed to Gaza, which it insists is part of the Palestinian homeland. Hamas this week suggested it would conditionally disarm in Lebanese Palestinian refugee camps under an agreement with the Lebanese government to remove the weapons of all Palestinian factions, negotiated by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas during a 3-day visit to Lebanon. Hamas reportedly insisted that disarmament would depend on granting Palestinians their civil and human rights, a reference to the lifting of restrictions on Palestinians' rights in Lebanon, including free access to the labor market. The push to disarm Hamas alongside other Palestinian factions in Lebanon also serves a broader US and Israeli effort to replicate elements of the 1982 model that forced Yasser Arafat's Palestine Liberation Organization to evacuate Beirut and move to Tunis, 3,500 kilometers away from Israel's borders. 64% of the Gazans polled by the Palestine Center for Policy and Survey Research opposed disarmament of Hamas, while 64% were against exiling the group's leaders, despite a substantial number of Gazans' resentment of Hamas. Mr. Netanyahu's elevation of Gazan resettlement to a war goal takes Israel's US-backed multi-pronged effort to empty the strip of its indigenous population and squash Palestinian national aspirations to a new level. Beyond Israel's demand that Hamas abandon Gaza, the effort involves Syria's recent expulsion of Hamas and other Palestinian operatives under US and Israeli pressure, and pressure on Lebanon to halt the flow of funds to Hamas through Lebanon. Thank you for joining me today. The Turbulent World with James M. Dorsey seeks to empower readers, listeners, and viewers to form informed opinions of their own. Equitable, fair, and honest analysis that lets the chips fall where they fall has seldom been more important in a world racked by brutal wars, unimaginable humanitarian crises, and increasing authoritarianism. If you share this vision, please consider becoming a paid subscriber by going to jamesmdorsey.substack.com. The Turbulent World can only sustain and expand its independent coverage, free of advertisements and clickbait, with the support of its readers. Thank you for your support and loyalty. Take care and best wishes.